Welcome to what will be the last video in this series for Workers and Resources Soviet Republic. In this video I'm going to do three things. The first thing I'm going to do is talk about the reasons why I'm bringing this series to an end. Secondly, I'm going to give you an update of where we are in the series because I've been playing on a little bit since the end of the last video. And then in the last part, what I'm going to do is go through what I see as some of the successes and the failures of this series. And more importantly, some of the lessons that I'm going to take forward into the new series, which will start in the new year. But before that, what I'd like to say is a big thank you to all of you who have followed the series, and more importantly, those of you who have found the time to post comments. I find all your comments very useful, even those comments which may come across as a bit negative in the sense that you are pointing out mistakes and talking about different ways to solve the problem. And it's those comments that I find the most interesting. And one thing I want to emphasize is that I regard those comments as a positive input, not you knocking me and my gameplay, because it's those comments that make me think about what I'm doing and reviewing my knowledge of the game. And in many ways, it's those comments that make me a better player. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to move on to why this series is coming to an end. And I'm going to be completely upfront. The reason this series is coming to an end is due to the planes and tourism and other items update, which was released on the 22nd of December 2020, if you're watching this in the future. And what I've done since the end of the last video is done quite a few hours of test play. I've gone around the map looking for where I could integrate airports and tourism into this map. I've even gone over and looked at the islands over here to see whether I could build a new town out in this area. And if I come over to Nuclear City here, you will see here that I've built a couple of railway bridges over the water straits here and a road bridge with a view to building a new town in this area. And I'll be completely honest, I can't find anywhere on this map where the new mechanics fit into the current economy. Yes, there are places like here where I could build an airport. It's possible that I will be able to build a tourist town, but it doesn't fit with the way the series has gone so far. And I think also the biggest problem is that to get out to some of these areas where I could build a tourist town, and of course we could then start using aircraft, I've got two options. I either spend 10 or 15 parts building bridges out to here, or the other alternative is that I kind of move away from the way I like to play and start using the big pile of cash I've got to start auto purchasing buildings. And I'm going to be completely honest, I could do that, but, and it's a very big but, I know me and the way what happens when I start to get into a stage in a game where I start to disconnect from it. And I know full well that after about 10 parts, I'm going to stop enjoying playing this series. And then once that happens, I have to stop, because one of my guiding principles for this channel is that I only play games that I enjoy playing and games that I want to share with the overall community. I'm not in the business of taking a sponsorship for a game that I don't like, and that's the reason why the games that I play on this channel are the way they are. After quite a lot of test play, I was finally had to accept that the only option is to start again, build an economy, include aircraft and tourism, and build up an economy where it all fits together and everything has a purpose. Apologies for anyone who's going to be upset about this series coming to an end. But what I will say is I do have a pretty good concept for what I want to do in the new series. We will be playing on a custom map, and the objective of the new series is to build a fully self-sustaining economy using all the features in the game. But I'll talk more about that when I do the introductory video for the new series. And I think this is probably a good point to break off why I'm not going to be carrying on the series. And I think I'll give you a bit of an update on what I've been doing. And I mean, it's a bit of a shame because we are making good progress. The farm here is now ready to go once we move into the growing season. You can see I've actually made the connections here. I've also got a couple of distribution offices already set up. This one's set up to bring all the crops in from the fields and deliver the crops to this silo and the other silo over here. You see we've only got 88 tons there. I'm going to talk a little bit more about crops later on. And one of the things I have been doing here, if I click on the factory here. See, you'll see I've got all sorts of vehicles queued up here, including tractors, buses, and covered holes, open holes, and a couple of concrete mixers. And the reason for that is that if I come over here, you will see here that the new construction building is now ready to go, and I've been populating this with vehicles built in the vehicle plant. Oh, look at that, snow's disappearing. Isn't that nice? And I have to admit, I am really starting to get the hang of the factory here. And I suppose just for completeness, I know this is the last part, but there are some things you just got to do. So I'm just going to put in that into there. Now, over in Nuclear City, of course, I've already mentioned the bridges that I was looking at with a view to expanding out here. The other thing I've also done is I've now completed out the oil area here, and this is going pretty well actually. I've got to connect up all the oil pumps. They're feeding the oil through into here, and what's actually happening is that the trains are pulling the oil out as fast as it's being produced, which I think is pretty good really, because that's a sign that the economy is getting into balance. And of course, over in Nuclear City, I did have a bit of a disaster through the winter, which has actually reduced the population in this area by a fair amount. I think we lost, let me just see. Yeah, I mean, we were over 40,000. We lost a few hundred, but you can see I've still got 1,273 plus 21s. And that was down to the fact this small heating plant was actually struggling to heat this whole area here. You can see here that the heat exchanger here was only at half capacity. So what I've actually done is put down a full-sized heating plant here with an aggregate store associated with it, and I've put a heat exchanger there. So the idea is once this heating plant will be on stream, this would ensure that there is full heating coverage in this area here. In fact, I think if I come in here, what I probably need to do is well, we have to connect the footpath there and there. I mean, some things you can't afford stopping. So this heating plant would be key to building up this area here. And I was looking at the shipping, and to be honest, when I started this map, I had a great feeling that I could do a lot of shipping. You probably could if I carried on playing, but at the moment I can't really identify any good shipping routes beyond the possibility of eventually building up this area over here, building a uranium mine, and then putting maybe a port out, say about here, because of course this is closed off, although we could probably cut a canal through here. Just putting a port here and using ships to move the uranium ore all the way to Nuclear City. But at the same time, you could equally argue that you could do it just as efficiently with trains. Again, it's a bit of an artificial construct. I mean, if I'd spent the time and got out, especially with the other oil deposits, I could have used tankers to bring the oil in from the other islands. But of course, the problem would be is actually how to connect up the islands to actually build the oil pipelines in the first place. And just to wind up this section on the current state of play, and again, I want to thank all of you who put comments in about crops and the supply lines, because you can see here we're only in February, and the crop situation is already starting to get a little bit desperate. We've only got 75 tons of crops in there. We've got down to 54 there, and 58 there, 76 there. And let's just go look here. I mean, this one's not bad. It's got 403. We've got 94 there, 71 there, 99, 102 there, 107 there. And these silos are already empty. And I think this is a pretty good example of how quickly crops are consumed when you're trying to go for self-sufficiency. It's really surprising the difference the season's update has actually made, because prior to the season's update, a farm like this would probably have 2, possibly 3 harvests a year, and this would be more than adequate to drive a economy consisting of around 40,000 people. Now, when I say they drive the economy, I'm also talking about the fact that crops are used for food, alcohol, livestock, fabric and chemicals. So as your economy grows, you do have this great demand for crops. I think that is probably enough of the update, and I might as well stick with crops, because this is one of what I would say my great lessons learned, because as I've already mentioned, I've really greatly underestimated 2 things. First, the sheer amount of crops that you've actually got to bring in to keep your economy self-sufficient, and the fact that there will be times when the economy will run out of crops. So therefore, when you're planning your crop distribution center, you do really need probably a slightly better version of what I've done over here, is actually have a warehouse that can be connected to a train, which then can then bring the crops in from the customs shed. I think this is going to be quite an important component as your economy grows and you want to use crops to drive all your different industries. And then that feeds into something that quite a few of them mentioned, is that I do really need to make this whole crop distribution system a lot more efficient. I think in some ways what you're going to have to do is separate out the food production from the production to the other industries. So what you're going to, so on a really good map, I mean this map's a little bit tricky due to the fact that the terrain, but I think that's what you'd really need to think of as your economy grows and expands. Have dedicated food productions with their associated farms, and then have other farms which are connected to a different supply chain, which will be supplying the crops to the fabric factories, the chemical plants, and possibly even to the livestock, and of course your alcohol consumption. And I think that's something I'm really going to need to investigate in some detail. So that's probably the first major lesson that I've taken from this series, and it is a direct result of the season's update. And the next lesson is also related to the season's update, and that is the increased importance of having a really good quality coal supply, because being able to heat your cities is very important. Because if you get a breakdown in heating like I did in Nuclear City in this winter, your population can drop incredibly quickly, especially if the heating goes off completely. And I think that is the justification for building up a very stable coal supply system. And I think probably the best way to do this is actually conveyors. But the mistake I made here is that this heating plant here really needed an aggregate store at the end of the conveyor, similar to here, because you can't really store enough inside these heating plants to get through the winter. And if you're not using conveyors, what you really do need is dedicated distribution centers which will contain dumpers which can keep these heating plants working really well. And on the positive side, I think up here this setup has been very effective, having a large aggregate store full of coal. This has kept this power station going, and more importantly being able to provide coal to this brickworks, the cement plant, and the actual prefab panels here as well, although this doesn't actually need coal. Never mind. And I think this is the key to really keeping your economy going, is a really good coal supply. And that actually leads me now onto distribution offices, because somebody actually asked me how many distribution offices I actually had in this economy, considering I've only got 40,000 people. And I've actually got 35 of them. And I know that seems a lot, but when I was actually looking at what each one does, you start to really think about the role of distribution offices in the way in keeping your economy stable. Because what you need to remember is, in fact, there's probably the better examples up here, is every one of these farms up here has a dedicated distribution office. This one's probably a little bit too big, which literally contains covered whole trucks whose sole responsibility is in gathering the harvest. And I think this combination works very well, because if you just put your covered whole trucks into the farm, you can't have very big farms. But when you use a dedicated distribution office, what you can do is really push the limits on how many farms you can have. You can see this farm's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. It's got 17 fields on it. Now there's no way a couple of covered holes could bring in the crops if they're just stationed in the farm. And of course the other downside is that when you've got the covered holes in a farm, they can only supply to a single silo. The advantage with using a dedicated distribution office is that, as you can see here, what I've been able to do is bring the crops in from the field and actually deliver them to either to an additional silo or even directly to a production area, though truthfully this probably isn't that efficient. Probably the most efficient way is to use these distribution offices to deliver the crops into the silos rather than a a manufacturing facility. And then what of course you could have then is another distribution office, which is I think this one here, which then takes the crops from the silos and then delivers it to the various places you want it. And I think this is probably the core of a very efficient crop distribution system, because that then gives the option to build relatively small distribution offices that can then push the food up to say an area like this, where you've actually got a silo which is being steadily supplied with crops, which then keeps a food factory going. And of course, with a food factory, if it is connected to a shopping area, you do really need the warehouses on each side, because another spin-off from the seasons update is that when the snows come, even when you've got the technical offices working hard, the speed of traffic slows up considerably, because what you really need in all your cities, especially as they get further and further away from the production areas, is to give them a stockpile in a warehouse like this, so that the population can be fed and supplied throughout a hard winter, is probably the polite way of saying it. And this comes down to something else I've found out about distribution offices, and it's not very easy to explain it here, but the way some goods move up this road here is actually done in stages. And what I've got here is a chain of distribution offices, where the first link in the chain pulls the items from the actual production areas, and then they just move it all up along the chain to a warehouse or a storage. And then another distribution office, like for example like this one, whose sole responsibility is actually moving goods along this great big long bridge here between Bridge City here and Trout Lake and these areas up here. And I think this is a very important thing you need to consider now if you're playing with the seasons update enabled, because if you set up really long supply routes and the winter comes, one truck may actually only do one round trip. Because you've got to remember is that if you are moving goods in one direction and there's no bilateral flow, what's going to happen is when a truck leaves, say, this distribution office, the first thing it's got to do is go all the way down to wherever it's going to pick up from, to pick up the goods to come all the way back. So you get a lot of wasted mileage. And I think this is another lesson that I've actually learned, that what you really do need to do is have a little bit of bilateral movement of goods if possible. And that also leads into the fact that I think now to really get around a big map, you do need trains. And I think the moving goods by train is one of my partial successes, because I've got it right in some areas here. This open store, I've got a train here effectively delivering the steel into this area. But of course, the problem is the train is clogging up this entry. While this is actually works, it's not as efficient as it should be. And I think part of the problem is in the pickup areas down here, that I spent a lot of time planning this. I didn't really plan it as well as I should have done, because what I really should have had is at least 2 warehouses to send out outward bound goods, and possibly even receive them. And I think there is, if I come to railways, there is a construct. Where is it? I'm sure there's a station where you can actually, that's it, cargo station in. I think this is probably the better option, is to build one of these and then connect the warehouses up to it. I've also got the equivalent for it in here with the train aggregate loading here as well. And I think possibly this might be the better option. This is loading and this is unloading. So what you could actually have here is multiple aggregate stores attached to allow trains carrying different resources to come in and drop things off. So this is something I do feel I need to explore more in the future. Yeah, this one's a combination of the two. You can see it's got open space storage for and warehouse storage. So this one's going to be one of the more useful ones. I think this is the big difference, that you can bring goods in and send goods out from these stations. So I think in my next series, when I was setting up distribution areas like this, I may not be using the rail links directly into the primary storage. What we'll be doing is using those train platforms to try and get a bit more efficiency out of the system. So what else have I actually learned from this series? Probably this isn't what I would say a direct lesson to do with efficiency. This is more of a lesson to do with aesthetics, and of course it does relate to mods. I think in the going forward that when I'm planning cities, I'm going to be more inclined to put the heating pipes underground using the mods and also the power lines here, because I must admit having these power lines through a city is pretty ugly. And if any of you are not too sure what I'm talking about, if I come into the mod workshop, we'll start with the power substations. There's this mod here. If I come in and just want to move back here, I don't know if you'll be able to see it. This is 750. Maybe I'll go to 150. What you'll see is you can put in something like this. Now these are quite expensive to build, so possibly when I'm in the starter city, we'll do it with above ground heating pipes and power cables. But I think once I start planning my major cities, I think this option is going to be really good, because what you can do is, I'll say, you can put in something like that. I'll see if I can just build it. And what you've got is a power line there, and what you've actually got is the substation here, which is what you'd build up to provide the power. And what you can do then is, when you come to here, I know this is a little bit artificial, but what you can do is bring the power line in from the outside, and what the mod actually provides is a whole series of distance right up to 1 kilometer. And I think that would be a very good way to get your power distribution into a city. So say, for example, say I needed to put another one in here. What I could do is, if I can find one of the fun elements of this mod is where the actual power lead is. So for example, say I wanted to put a substation in there. If you look up just where that bus is, you'll see the opposite end. And so what you're able to do is put in a substation in the middle of a city without all these horrible overhead cables. And that also applies to the heating as well. And what you'll see, if I can come in with this one, what you'll find is that, again, I'll just do 100 meters. What you'll find is this actually works in the opposite way to the power stations, in the sense that what you do is you have the heating like this, and then you build an underground connection here. You can see this comes in 100, 200, 300. Now you can also have an underground switch here as well to connect things up with. And I think this one, these are the above ground big distribution things as well. And this is actually an underground, this is an underground pumping station. And again, what I'll be doing in my new series is using a lot more of those, because I just think makes the cities look more aesthetically tidy, is probably the honest truth for it. And I think that is about the major lessons I've learnt from this series. And I think to wind up the video, I'm going to talk about something that some of you might find a little bit controversial, simply because I've had a few comments during the series about the length of my conveyor belt systems. And I will accept that I've got a little bit carried away with this branch here, and I could probably have been more efficient to bring it up with rail if I'd been able to build the rail. You can see this conveyor belt runs for a long time, and of course to be able to build this I had to take advantage of a mod. And I think, again, this is one of the best mods in the game. And even if you're not a big fan of mods, I certainly recommend getting this mod here, where you can actually lay in these transfer towers. For two reasons. One, they've got footpaths, but more importantly, compared to the standard one, you can see if I zoom in on this transfer tower, in fact, if I show you an example of this line here, what you'll see is that these transfer towers keep the conveyor elevated, which means you can bring roads in underneath them. You don't get that awkward problem you get with the in-game towers where you've got the slope. I think I'd have to go all the way down to here, where, as I say, the in-game tower has this where it starts low, goes high, and it goes up in a series of steps. Personally, I actually feel that whoever created this mod has a more realistic view of the way conveyors actually do work in real life, although probably conveyors aren't normally as high as they are here. And I would argue in my defense that there are certain conveyor lines, especially with respect to gravel and coal, that justify a fairly long conveyor system, like say bringing down the ores down off the mountains, and also supplying coal to heating plants, because these heating plants don't really have the capacity to store coal for a whole winter. So what you really would need to do is have an aggregate store in front of it. That works especially well if I come over to here, with when you've got a heating plant that's out in the middle of nowhere, possibly in a remote location, and that is to have the heat a small aggregate store here. And you can see what that does is that ensures that there's enough coal in here to get through the winter, even if the trucks are slowed down by bad weather. And I think in a major settlement though, and especially if the coal supply is nearby, you really do need to look a lot more at conveyors, look at them for supplying resources to key buildings like power stations, heating plants. I mean, to be honest, there's no way I could have kept all this going using trucks. And this conveyor belt system has been the real key to driving this whole industry here, because not only is it driving the heating plant and the power station, it's also supplying a brick factory indirectly with trucks from here. It's also driving the coal into the steel mill, and which is also helping really well. And I think that's use of conveyors is probably pretty key to the way you can get things done in the game. On that point, this is where I'm going to leave it. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you found it interesting. Again, apologies if anybody's upset in the fact that I'm bringing the series to an end. But what I will guarantee is there's going to be a lot more content for Workers and Resources Soviet Republic in the future. The new series will start probably pretty quickly into the new year. I've got a few things to tidy up on the custom map that I've actually made for that series. But more about that in the introductory video for the series. So until next time, whatever you do, enjoy your gaming.